Scope 3 emissions are erasing facility level efficiency progress. The efficiency gains at your facilities are real. So is the Scope 3 exposure in your supply chain. For most manufacturers and retailers, the second number is not just larger. It is so much larger that the first number barely registers against it. And the rules governing how that second number must be measured, verified, and disclosed are tightening faster than most supplier engagement programs are built to handle. Organizations that have invested years and significant capital in facility-level energy efficiency are discovering that their reported carbon progress is being undermined by emissions growth in their supplier networks. The efficiency gains are real. The Scope 3 emissions are also real, and the gap between the two is becoming harder to obscure in disclosure documents, investor reviews, and the regulatory frameworks taking shape in California and Europe. For sustainability leaders trying to close the gap between facility performance and corporate climate commitments, the math increasingly doesn't work on efficiency alone. And in 2026, the accountability infrastructure around that math is being substantially upgraded. Why facility efficiency programs don't reach Scope 3 emissions. CDP and BCG's supply chain emissions analysis found that corporate supply chain Scope 3 emissions are 26x higher than operational emissions on average. That figure is not a rounding error. It reflects a structural reality. Most of what a company is responsible for in carbon terms occurs outside its own walls, in the facilities, logistics networks, and production processes of its suppliers. June 2024 data from CDP reveals that upstream Scope 3 emissions for manufacturers and retailers are 26x higher than direct operational emissions. This creates a combined carbon liability exceeding $335 billion, yet only 15% of companies have set formal upstream emissions targets. That liability is not on most balance sheets. It is not in most risk disclosures. And it is growing while facility efficiency programs address a fraction of it. Facility efficiency programs address Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions directly. They do not touch Scope 3 unless the organization is actively requiring suppliers to match efficiency improvements with their own carbon performance. Most organizations are not doing that in a systematic way. Supplier engagement programs are common. Binding supplier requirements tied to carbon performance are not. And even where requirements exist, verification of supplier energy data is inconsistent. What CDP data shows about the scale of the engagement gap. CDP's supply chain research documents an engagement gap that is wider than most corporate communications suggest. Only 15% of disclosing companies have set a supply chain emissions target of any kind. Only 4 in 10 corporates engage with their suppliers on climate issues at all. And among companies with formal supplier engagement programs, only 23% require suppliers to set carbon reduction targets. Of those that require targets, fewer than half have a process for verifying reported progress. In 2025, over 270 corporate buyers utilized CDP's supply chain program to request environmental data from approximately 45,000 suppliers, with reporting companies identifying $54.4 billion in savings from emissions reduction activities. This initiative, which includes major corporations tracking Scope 3 emissions, represents a significant portion of the global market capitalization, fostering increased transparency. That response rate means that the majority of supplier-level emissions data that purchasing organizations need to manage their Scope 3 exposure is either estimated through spend-based proxies or simply absent from the reporting. Based on the 2025 State of Supply Chain Sustainability Report from the MIT Sustainable Supply Chain Lab, which surveyed over 1,200 professionals, roughly 80% of businesses surveyed indicated that sustainability is important or extremely important to their long-term success. Despite economic headwinds, most organizations are maintaining or increasing these efforts. How the GHG Protocol revision is raising the verification bar. The GHG Protocol published its Scope 3 Standard Revisions Phase 1 Progress Update on March 31, 2026, the first major proposed update to the standard since 2011. The working group held 42 meetings between September 2024 and the end of 2025. The direction of travel is clear even before the final standard is issued in 2027. The proposed revisions include a 95% coverage floor, meaning companies would be required to account for at least 95% of their Scope 3 emissions, with any excluded portion capped at 5% and justified with data. Tail spend suppliers that were left out of most Scope 3 inventories under the current standard would need to be included or formally documented as below the exclusion threshold. The proposal also introduces data quality tiers that would require companies to disclose what proportion of their Scope 3 figures come from supplier-specific primary data versus spend-based estimates, which are the least reliable tier. For organizations currently reporting Scope 3 figures built primarily on spend-based estimates, the Phase 1 proposals represent a methodology gap that will need to be closed before the next standard cycle. Organizations that build supplier data infrastructure now will be better positioned than those that wait for a final rule. How the Scope 3 gap grows as supply chains expand. The Scope 3 problem is not static. For organizations that have been expanding supplier networks through manufacturing reshoring, nearshoring, or supply chain diversification strategies since 2022, new suppliers have entered the value chain without the carbon performance baseline that more established suppliers might have. Procurement teams making supplier decisions on cost, lead time, and resilience criteria are creating Scope 3 implications that sustainability teams then need to account for, often after the contracts are already signed. CDP data illustrates the compounding effect. Companies that engage with their suppliers on climate issues are almost 7x more likely to have a Scope 3 target and a 1.5-degree aligned transition plan. But most companies are not engaging their suppliers in any systematic way. The organizations adding suppliers through diversification without a parallel sustainability onboarding process are widening their exposure with every contract signed. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, requires companies pursuing corporate-level validation to include a Scope 3 strategy. But the rigor of that strategy is inconsistent, and timelines for Scope 3 reduction are frequently longer than Scope 1 and 2 commitments, creating a structural gap between reported progress and actual carbon trajectory. For organizations with public climate commitments, that structural gap is increasingly a disclosure risk as well as a credibility one. What the regulatory calendar means for Scope 3 accountability in 2026 and beyond. The regulatory environment around Scope 3 disclosure is tightening on multiple fronts simultaneously. California's SB 253, the Corporate Climate Data Accountability Act, requires large companies doing business in California to report Scope 3 emissions. Limited assurance for Scope 3 will be evaluated by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, with requirements expected no earlier than 2030. CARB's proposed rulemaking is anticipated in the first quarter of 2026, with public comment to follow. Whether and how materiality applies to Scope 3 disclosures under SB 253 is a key open question that CARB's guidance will need to resolve. In Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, applies to approximately 5,000 to 10,000 large companies following the EU's Omnibus 1 simplification, down from an earlier scope of roughly 50,000 firms. The revised European Sustainability Reporting Standards, currently under a new simplification framework, will determine the methodology for those Scope 3 disclosures. As of September 2025, 37 countries had adopted or were in the process of adopting ISSB standards, creating a global baseline for Scope 3 reporting that did not exist 5 years ago. For sustainability leaders, the practical implication is that the Scope 3 data quality and methodology gaps that were manageable in a voluntary disclosure environment are becoming exposure points in a mandatory disclosure one. Organizations that have been reporting Scope 3 figures assembled from spend-based estimates and unverified supplier questionnaires will face increasing scrutiny from auditors, investors, and regulators as assurance requirements expand. What sustainability leaders need to change about supplier engagement. The organizations managing Scope 3 exposure most effectively are setting binding carbon performance requirements in supplier contracts, not aspirational engagement criteria. They are requiring supplier-level energy and emissions data in a standardized format that can support verification, not self-reported questionnaire responses that cannot. And they are factoring Scope 3 trajectory into procurement decisions alongside cost and quality criteria, which requires sustainability teams to be in the procurement process before contracts are awarded, not after. CDP's research identifies three significant drivers of action on supply chain emissions: a climate responsible board, supplier engagement, internal carbon pricing. Organizations with an internal carbon price mandated for all business decisions are 4x more likely to have a Scope 3 target and a 1.5-degree aligned Scope 3 transition plan. That correlation matters because it identifies the organizational conditions under which Scope 3 management moves from a reporting exercise to a strategic one. None of this is technically complicated. It is organizationally complicated. The cross-functional process required to integrate sustainability criteria into procurement decisions runs against the way most procurement organizations currently operate. Closing that gap is the work that actually moves the Scope 3 number. And with the GHG Protocol revision, California SB 253, and growing investor focus on supply chain emissions, all converging in 2026 and 2027, the window for addressing it proactively is shorter than it looks from inside most annual reporting cycles. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.